In this lesson, we're going to learn several ways to create an environment in our scene. So far from the last lesson, we have a basic scene that doesn't have any textures. We have a plain white override material, and we have a V-Ray sun to our right. What we're going to do now is start looking at some of the ways that we can add an environment. So what we're going to do with that is that it's going to change the color that is given by the light into the scene, and it's also going to change the way objects within the scene reflect the environment around them. So what we need to do first of all to our model is we need to create, or at least add, a texture to the model that can reflect something happening on the outside. Otherwise we won't really be able to see any of the changes we make to the environment. So what we're going to do is, let's look at our model in plan, and I'm firstly going to ungroup, or rather open the groups to all the objects within the entire scene. So if you remember, when we did the window frames, the glass and the frame is grouped into one single group, which means that in order for me to texture the glass, which I'm going to do now, I need to open those groups up. So firstly, what I'm going to do is move, or at least apply, the override material to all of the objects in the scene. So I'm just going to do that in one quick go, and then I'm going to create a new glass material. So double click on V-Ray material, rename it to glass, and for the diffuse you can use plain black. For the reflect you can use a low number. I don't generally go all the way to white like most other tutorials may mention. I go about 1/3 of the way down to about 60 or so. Then for the refraction, I go almost all the way to the bottom, and then just remember, try not to use 255. Now you can click on the background and you'll see what that material looks like. So let's go ahead now in our layer manager and select glass and water, and click select highlighted object and layers. Next, apply that glass material to those objects, and we can even go and close all those groups now. Now let's look at one of the cameras. We can choose either one or two, and let's quickly do another test render just to see how everything looks without any environmental changes, so that we can just gauge the difference as we go along. So here's our model. You can see that our rendering time has gone up from 9 seconds to 16. So having that glass reflecting the blackness of the sky is making a slight change. So what we're going to do now is start applying different effects to the environment. So with this, if I just make it a little bit smaller to the side here, what we're going to do first of all is hit F10 and go into our environment area. So let's close down all of these tabs and let's go into environment. So right now what's happening is we have an off-white material giving us this general light, and we have a plain black that is being reflected and refracted. That means that all of these grays that you're seeing are not coming from this black background, but are coming from this material or this color. What you can do now is you can just play around with the color slot of your main light. You can create a very dark blue color, something that you would get in a night scene, so you could desaturate it and make it quite dark, and you could just see the effect that that gives. So generally this would be a good setup. You could even copy these two so that you have similar reflections as you do refractions. This would be a very simple setup for a basic night view. Let me just reduce the saturation ever so slightly so that we don't have a completely blue model, and let's see the effect that this gives us. I'm just going to pause the video again and then come back to the finished render. So here's our render with that darker blue GI environment. You'll see that that blue starts to play mainly on the shadows because the light coming from the sun is overpowering whatever the light is given from the actual environment itself. So whatever you do here, just remember what type of changes you will have on the side. So now we're going to move across to the second type of environment that you can have, which is called a V-Ray sky. So to load that up, let's press M on our keyboards and open the material editor. Then in our Get Material button, we can scroll down to V-Ray sky, which is this one here, and then you can rename that. So let's call it V-Ray sky. You can choose a manual sun node, which is a good idea, so that the direction, or at least the light source, is coming around where the sun is. So we're going to click on none, and then we're going to hit H on our keyboards and then scroll down to V-Ray sun. That's the only sun that we have in our scene at the moment. So basically the two become linked. Next we're going to drop our intensity multiplier to about 1.15 or so, perhaps even lower. You can just see the preview. And next we're going to increase this slightly. And you can also play with the sun turbidity, or turbidity if you pronounce it that way. And generally that can be around 5 or so, 5, 6 if you want a very sort of a misty or a denser sunset, or you could have it around 2 if you want a much sharper blue and white color. So you can just have a look at those figures. 2.4 generally is a okay figure. Next we can take that slot and we can drag it into our 2 environment slots. So again, I'm just going to pause the video and we're going to come back to the completed render. So there we have it. It's been completed. You can have a look at the times as well. We haven't really gone up in time at all. So the V-Ray Sky is quite a nice option. It doesn't slow things down a lot. And it does give you some good color variation from the blues to the lighter colors. So you don't necessarily have the boring one color approach with the flat material here. You do have that variation that Sky offers you. So quite a nice solution to your lighting setup. The next one we're going to look at is a V-Ray HDRI. So to get that, it's very similar to the V-Ray Sky, the process by which we load it up. So let's go to Get Material again, and let's now go to V-Ray HDRI, which is this one. Double click on it, and let's call this HDRI 1. And let's browse for that. Now in your project files, you'll have 3D Max files and then textures, and I have provided a whole range or a whole choice of HDRI files for you to try. Within these, where you see the names being the same, the environment is a low-res blurred file that you will use for your light source, and the REF is the reflection HDRI that you will use only in your reflection slot. So this allows you to use the two together, and it basically means that when your HDRI is providing light, if you do use a very high-res, sharp, focused image, it's probably going to provide, or at least rather spill, a lot of little spots and grains of light around your scene. So that is why low-res blurred versions are much more diffused and they give you a much nicer wash of color. So that just explains the difference if you were wondering. So I'm going to give this one a try. We're going to look at the CG Skies free sample. You can have a look at their website as well. They do provide some pretty good information about how to set up HDRIs. So let's go and load that one up. I'm going to look at the blurred version. And I'm just going to take the quick approach of using the blurred version for the main light source as well as the secondary light source, the environment. So let's now go and drag that in. I'm going to instance them as well. And now both of those are V-Ray HDRI. So as soon as we have a slot in here and as soon as that is ticked, these colors don't come into effect. So it doesn't really matter what this color is as long as you have this in play. You may also see from your preview that it is quite dark, so you can look at the overall multiplier. So let's put this at about 4, which is going to boost that light quite a lot. So now I'm going to render this again, so pause the video and then we'll get back to the finished render. So here we have the result with the HDRI, both in the skylight as well as the reflection slots. And you'll see that the difference is not extremely different. We do have quite a good HDRI here, which doesn't overcolor or oversaturate the scene, so that's why I chose it. And the other thing that I can just mention in the HDRI slot is you do have the gamma as well that you can adjust. The lower you have your gamma, the more intense your light will be. So I'm just going to pause the video again and just have a look at the difference between these, the 0.8 gamma and the 1.0 gamma. So here is the result with the gamma dropped down. I actually dropped it down even more, now till 0.6, and you'll see that the light source is a little bit stronger as well. So the other thing that we can do is we can have a look at what our scene would look like without any sun. This would actually be the better way of testing your HDRIs, is to see if you can use them as the principal light source. So again, I'm going to do the same render without the sun this time. There is our result without the sun, so you'll notice that all of this light is now only being driven by the HDRI file itself. You may notice that it's a little bit cooler since the sun was giving it some warmth as the principal light, but it's a good idea to actually test out your HDRIs without any other light source whatsoever. So turn absolutely everything off and just have one single HDRI so that you can see what the mood lighting is actually doing. So the last thing that I want to quickly cover in this course, or at least in this lesson rather, is going to be a different way of applying the light, the HDRI light. And CG Skies actually recommends this in their website. So what you do here is you select a V-Ray light, choose it, the type will be a dome, so you can choose that. The multiplier you can drop to about 5 or 4 or 10, it doesn't really matter. And then down below, what they actually recommend is that you create two. One you will only use as your diffuse, and the second one you will uncheck diffuse and only have specular and reflections selected. So again, you can go to their website and just have a look at their tutorial if you really want to go into more depth and detail. And the last thing to do to this light to actually activate the HDRI function is to drop your HDRI file into the texture slot, and that will then give that light the function of the HDRI. Now before we render that, let's go to our environment slots and just turn off all of the V-Ray environments so that the dome light is actually now going to create all of the lighting for us. So let's pause the video again and just see that result. So to finish off, here is our rendered scene with the dome light, the V-Ray, implemented into the actual texture slot of that dome light. And let's just have a look at some of those settings that were used. Basically here the multiplier was 5, so it wasn't too high. The multiplier in the texture slot was 2, and the gamma was dropped to 0.8 just to give it that intensity. And then over here we chose not to make it invisible. If you uncheck this, you're going to see the V-Ray texture in the background of your scene. And then down here, as lastly, I have increased the subdivisions to 32. So that is it for this lesson. The next one we're going to look at how we can create more or have more control over the reflection in our scene, and all of that will be covered in the next lesson.